Hail, fellow travelers. Tim from Secret Fire Books here with another Random Book Wednesday. And on this week's episode, I'm going to be talking about two horror stories that I read in this book. Dark Fantasy, Lovecraft Short Stories. This is one of those big hardcover collections put out by Flame Tree Books. I don't know if you can see the logo very well. My camera will not focus for whatever reason. Flame Tree have been around for a while. I've seen their books in bookstores and online all over the place. They have a ton of these hardcover collections that compile a bunch of short stories on a variety of different topics from a variety of different genres. I would actually recommend looking up their website and checking out what they have because they're relatively affordable hardcovers of pretty decent quality. The page quality and the end papers and the actual boards of these books themselves are pretty high quality for what you're paying. But as the title of the book would suggest, it is a massive collection of Lovecraft stories, H.P. Lovecraft short stories. That said, it also contains a smattering of other stories by other writers, some of H.P. Lovecraft's fellow Weird Tales writers. It does contain two short stories by Robert E. Howard, The Thing on the Roof and The Black Stone, neither of which I'm a huge fan of. I love Robert E. Howard's adventure and fantasy stories, but I'm not a huge fan of his horror. I always find that his horror leaves something to be desired. It also does have two other stories by two other writers, and those are the stories I'm going to be talking about today, because not only do they both share a certain theme, that being that the protagonists of both stories are actually horror authors, which I thought was pretty interesting, but they were also written by real-world authors who were also, like Robert E. Howard, friends and correspondents of H.P. Lovecraft himself. The first short story that I want to talk about is The Shambler from the Stars by Robert Bloch. Now, I've read a little bit of Robert Bloch before. I think he's a good writer. I've read his short story, The Black Kiss, which I actually find is a very interesting kind of alternate take on the H.P. Lovecraft story, The Shadow over Innsmouth. It isn't a ripoff of Innsmouth in any way, but I find it does take that core theme that Innsmouth was going with, and it takes it in a completely different direction that I really, really like. And then I've also read his novel Psycho, which is a classic psychological horror thriller novel. It's a good book. Everybody likes Psycho. But with Shambler from the Stars, I was actually kind of disappointed. As I mentioned, the main character is a horror writer, and for whatever reason, this guy is trying so hard to ruin his own life. From the beginning, we learned that this writer is dead set on finding one of the legendary ancient volumes of the Lovecraft mythos. He so badly wants to find a copy of the Necronomicon, or the Book of Abon, or the Book of Nameless Cults. And so he searches high and low for these ancient grimoires, these ancient occult texts. And he eventually stumbles upon a copy of a book called Mysteries of the Worm, and it's written entirely in Latin. And so he takes it to a friend of his who can translate. He talks to this friend of his into doing it for him after some pushback at first. And as this friend of his starts translating the words from the book out loud, horrible cosmic shenanigans ensues. And I can't really go much further into the story without spoiling the whole thing. There's really not a whole lot to this story. Where it fell flat for me is, first of all, it's way too predictable, and that is something that I cannot stand with horror stories. When I'm reading a horror story, I want to be on my toes constantly. I want to be constantly guessing and double guessing where the plot is going to go. And unfortunately, from the first few paragraphs of this short story, I knew exactly how it was going to end. But even worse than that is the fact that with Shambler from the Stars, Robert Bloch is trying so hard to emulate H.P. Lovecraft. The thing is, I know that Bloch was kind of a protege of H.P. Lovecraft. They were pen pals, as H.P. Lovecraft was, with a bunch of other Weird Tales writers. I think they might have met up in person once or twice and swapped short story ideas. So, bottom line, Robert Bloch really looked up to H.P. Lovecraft. A lot of his early writing was heavily inspired by Lovecraft. And with this story, it is agonizingly clear from the prose all the way to the ending of the story that he's just trying so hard to be H.P. Lovecraft. It's kind of embarrassing. The thing is, Robert Bloch has this very kind of workmanlike prose. He usually uses short sentence structure, and he gets to the point fairly quickly. His writing style moves along at a fairly fast pace. But with Shambler of the Stars, he's being very flowery and overdramatic. He's using a lot of big words, a lot of purplish prose, and really taking his time with this fairly short story. And so, yeah, it's just obvious how much he's trying to emulate Lovecraft. This story ends up becoming kind of like The Hound. And by that, I mean The Hound is an H.P. Lovecraft story that's trying so hard to be an Edgar Allan Poe story. And so, by extension, Shambler from the Stars is Robert Bloch trying to write an H.P. Lovecraft story. And it just doesn't work. Contrastingly, the second story I wanted to talk about was The Hunters from Beyond by Clark Ashton Smith. Now, Smith is a writer I've wanted to get into for a while. I've only read one of his stories before, and it was a very, very short story. I don't think I got much of a taste for his writing style, and I think I definitely got a better sampler with this story. Once again, it is about a horror writer. The main character is this pulp horror writer, which is fun. And he's paying a visit to his cousin's studio apartment. His cousin is this kind of eccentric new age sculptor who's desperately trying to break out into the art world. And he wants his cousin to stop by and look at his new sculptures. And so while he's on his way to his cousin's apartment, the narrator, he finds that he has some extra time on his hands. So he stops at a bookstore on the way. And here we get the opening sentence for the story, which absolutely floored me. It says, "I have seldom been able to resist the allurement of a bookstore, particularly one that is well supplied with rare and exotic items." Bro, that is literally me. So he's in the antique book section, perusing all of these musty old volumes, and he looks up from one of them, and he sees this horrible, demonic-looking thing standing in front of him. And Clark Ashton Smith dedicates this huge paragraph to describing this monster in grisly, foul, vivid detail. And this thing is just staring at our narrator, and it's making its way towards him. And our narrator is petrified with fear, and he drops his book, and the shock of dropping the book on the floor snaps him out of this trance, and he looks around, and the monster is just gone, as if it never existed. And so, still kind of in a daze, he pays for his book, he walks out of the shop, goes to his cousin's apartment. His cousin lets him in, shows him around, shows him all of these new sculptures he's been working on. And to our main character's horror, he finds that his cousin's sculptures look exactly like the monster he just saw in the bookstore. And that's where I'm going to end that there, because again, this is a fairly short story, and I don't want to spoil it. Now, unlike Shambler from the Stars, I thought this story was absolutely masterful. Like I said, I got a much better taste of Clark Ashton Smith's writing style, I think. He, like H.P. Lovecraft, has a very descriptive, flowery writing style, but particularly when it comes to the monsters that he's describing in this story. And I've heard that about him, that whenever it comes to the more horrific elements of his story, he gets very descriptive. And just seeing the words that he uses to describe these creatures and the phenomena that goes on around them was awesome. If all of Clark Ashton Smith's stories are anything like this is an author that I have seriously got to invest more time into. And also, unlike Shambler from the Stars, this story has a few twists going on. There were quite a few times where I thought I figured out what was going on with the plot, and then it zigged where I thought it was going to zag, so it kept me on my toes. And I will say that, if anything, I think it was a few sentences too long. The last few sentences of this story, I feel, kind of diminish the big shock value that you get from the climax of the story. But all in all, I think it was wonderfully done. But that's just my opinion, guys. Let me know in the comments below. Have you read either of these short stories? What did you think of them? And regardless, I hope you'll join me for my next random book review. Until then, as always, farewell and keep reading.